Brian, thanks very much for joining us today, and obviously just come off the back of a very sort of insightful panel at the World Energy Capital Assembly, and it's good to pick your brain and maybe delve into some of these topics in a bit more detail. But before we do, you obviously have had an illustrious career at BP, spanning 34 years, spent 9 years on the board as CFO, and announced your retirement back in 2020. You're now chairman at INEOS. What was the motivation behind sort of coming out of retirement and joining INEOS? What opportunity did you see, and what excited you about it?
Oh, look, I mean, I had a great time at BP with 34 years, learnt a huge amount about the industry, and was Jim Ratcliffe, who runs INEOS, approached me towards the end of 2020, having spent sort of 3 or 4 months out of the sector, having retired. And he had started to build out an energy business, an oil and gas business at that point, and effectively was asking about kind of, where could we take it going forward? And that kind of piqued interest. One, because it's private, and Jim had successfully built out a chemical company over the best part of 25 years now, and has built INEOS into the third largest petrochemical company in the world. And the question was, well, what can we do in the energy space? And given the energy transition, the opportunities that we saw, given the industrial base that INEOS has, between the two of us, we thought actually maybe we should see if we can't move this and play in the energy transition. And that really starts the journey with INEOS 2 years ago. And since then, we've invested deeper into oil and gas. So we've rebalanced our portfolio to roughly 50-50. It's about 55-45 gas and oil. We've invested in LNG trading, started to build out an LNG business. We've developed and are progressing, and we're beginning shortly to invest in and injecting carbon dioxide into a reservoir in Denmark to see if we can test out some CCUS potential and potentially create an injection opportunity for Denmark that could meet up to 40% of its requirements. And we've invested in Hydrogen One Capital, which is sort of a long-range look at what's going on in the hydrogen space. That's going to take time to develop, because hydrogen has all sorts of issues with it in terms of its suitability. But from a low carbon energy source perspective, it can help you with the carbon balance sheet. So it's a pretty exciting time, and it's great to be back in the industry. And what's now 2 years on from when I retired. So no, I'm having a lot of fun right now.
Fantastic. Thanks, Brian, and plenty to delve into there and pick your brain on. But I think before I do, obviously, just looking at the current environment, we've recently had the UK government announce a windfall tax. I mean, what implications will this have, in your opinion, on investment into the sector, into the North Sea, and in sort of UK and European domestic energy at a time when the continent and the world really is crying out for improved energy security, and obviously the role that domestic energy has as well in reducing emissions and so on? So what implications do you think the windfall tax could have on future investment?
Well, look, I've been around the sector long enough, and around the UK, in some respects, this is one of the more stable fiscal regimes we've been under for quite some time now in terms of the North Sea. But you see periods of time when you see super high profits, particularly from certain companies that have very large trading operations. That puts pressure on governments to respond and react. This government's reacted in 2 tranches, one with the first EPL of 25%, and now with 35%. I think it will impact long-term investment. It has to. When you have the opportunity to invest here at 75% tax, or a much lower tax rate overseas, I think you'll find companies will do that. So therefore, it will impact over the next medium term, delivering local domestic energy production, and that will therefore create an over-reliance on importing energy from overseas, which we've seen through LNG. And the UK has done a pretty good job of creating LNG import hubs. We still need more gas storage in this country, and I think Rough coming back online is really important in terms of energy security and stabilising energy markets. But it's the government's choice. They wish to take more fiscal take. Governments around the world, I wouldn't be surprised if you see the same thing in other parts of the world. But countries and companies will now need to determine where they will then put their capital. And I think it makes it harder. The investment case for the UK gets harder at these higher tax rates. At a time when Europe and the UK is particularly challenged from an energy perspective and is significantly disadvantaged in the cost of its energy. Energy in the United States is about 1/3 of the cost of what it is here in Europe. So if you think about going into recession and coming out of that recession, I think it will disadvantage us in terms of being able to tap into lower energy sources. But it just also re-emphasizes why we have to invest in all types of energy. And we will need incentives to be able to do that. And decarbonisation, carbon capture and storage, is a big important part of it. We'll need incentives to be able to do that as well.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think my next question, I want to delve into some of that in a little more detail and touch on some of the points you raised in your opening sort of comments there. But I know on the panel you just sat on with Lord Brown and Martin Lovegrove, they both alluded to how the world population has now hit the 8 billion people mark, which is significant. And I think we still in Europe have this debate of oil and gas versus renewables. It's a case of many people campaigning to turn the taps off and thinking we can just wave this magic wand and suddenly bridge the energy supply gap that's left. I think it's not realistic, and I think the conversation rather needs to be around how we bring together all forms of energy to meet increasing energy demand, and how we do that in the most, I guess, efficient and sustainable way possible, and again, leveraging all forms of energy. How are INEOS approaching this?
Well, so actually, if you come back to, so the population just gone over 8 billion, it took us 50 years, actually 47 years, to go from 4 billion to 8 billion people. It took the same amount of time to go from 2 to 4 billion in the previous 50 years. So the population is growing at a very fast rate. Energy, economic growth and population growth are all inextricably linked. The need for energy across the whole suite of potential options is even more important now than it's ever been. From an INEOS perspective, we have to look at the energy we need for our industrial heart base. And so where's that energy coming from? The mix. So we've already invested hugely in acquiring wind energy. We invest from various grids, green energy where we can. And we have targets around CO2 reductions. I think one of the really interesting pieces is in this binary argument, turn on renewables, turn off fossil fuel. There's some really important points. John Brown gave a speech back in 1997 which talked about the importance of the balance of probabilities that actually climate change was real. And that was 25 years ago. Fossil fuels made up 85% of the energy mix 25 years ago. Today it makes up 82%. Renewables have grown from something around 0.2% when he gave that speech, or 0.4%, up to about 6.7% today. Nuclear has gone down. Coal energy consumption is actually at its second highest year in 2021 over the previous 200 or 150 years it's been used. So we've got all of these competing dilemmas that we talk about, and we need to come back to what we need is a stable source of energy supply, baseload energy, which is why nuclear is so important. And I can give you examples why I believe Germany is a great example of how not to implement policy around an energy transition. And the fact that actually even before the Ukraine war, Germany was the largest consumer. Its primary source of energy was coal. Prior to the Ukraine war, it's even more so now. We need to invest in incentives and provide incentives to companies to invest in decarbonising the system. If you go back to Paris in 2015 and the goals that were set out about well below 2 degrees centigrade, which have now translated to 1.5, the assumption was somewhere between 40 to 50% of all CO2 would have to be sequestered or stored in some fashion. So we need to find carbon sinks. We haven't spent enough time over the last 25 years investing in those solutions. And that was a little bit what John was talking around beyond net zero and some of the goals that they were laying out there in terms of kind of how do we incentivize people to deal with the carbon capture? Because we are going to need fossil fuels. You can't turn them off. In fact, even the UK Intergovernment Panel has said that we will need more fossil fuels in 2050 generating electricity than we generate today in total. So if you look at all the power that we generate today, in 2050 the assumption is more than what we generate today will be required, and it will come from fossil fuel. But only if we can deal with the decarbonisation of that. So from an INEOS perspective, we are looking at a suite of options. We're looking at carbon capture and storage. We're involved in 4 out of the 9 projects in Europe. If all of those 9 projects are successful, that will still only meet about 50 to 60% of Europe's requirements for carbon capture and storage. So it just says we've got a lot more to do. We're looking at decarbonising our own industrial operations, and we can do that through, as I said, accessing green energy. And we're also looking at recognising that we have full cycle plastics. So how do you get into a full cycle plastic that you reuse and reuse and reuse again? And that will be another part of the circular economy going forward. So we're looking at a whole plethora of different suites. And then hydrogen is a really interesting opportunity for us, and particularly green hydrogen and blue hydrogen. Blue hydrogen where you can carbon capture, so and creating a hydrogen-based off, assuming you can take care of the CO2. And green hydrogen from electrolysis. And if you think about places where you could take solar or wind, create hydrogen as an energy solution, and then be able to transport it, that really gets interesting. The only issue with that today is it takes more energy to create green hydrogen than green hydrogen supplies as an energy source. So it's really part of the carbon balance sheet solution. It's not part of the bigger solution. But it could make up to 15% of the energy mix out in 2050. But I think governments will need to start to come up with integrated solutions. And they'll need to incentivize companies that have, particularly this sector, the oil and gas sector, has the technological know-how to be able to implement those technologies.
No, it's really interesting. And I think one example that I'd like to draw on in a little more detail is around CCUS. I know you mentioned both now and on the panel that you've currently got a CCUS project or CCS project in Denmark. And I think you mentioned you're going to inject CO2 back into a reservoir in December. I mean, one of the main bits of feedback that we receive from investors across our network is that CCUS projects, as you say, are fundamental to this decarbonisation pathway. Fossil fuels are required for years to come, and that's going to be a core part of meeting those decarbonisation goals. But at the same time, the project fundamentals in many cases just don't add up, and they differ from geography to geography. I mean, are you able to talk about your CCUS projects in more detail? Why, if that's successful, could it be a game changer? And I think what appetite are you seeing from private markets in particular, but investors more broadly in investing in these types of projects, and what needs to be done to further incentivize capital deployment in the space?
So I think I've been around CCS now for the best part of 20 years, actually more than 20 years, because we looked at when I was at BP back in 2000. I think there are some specific characteristics which make this one unique, but other reservoirs can be replicated. First of all, it's a sandstone reservoir. And it's a sandstone reservoir that we've known for 25, 30 years because we've been extracting hydrocarbons from it. And therefore, we know the geology, we know the porosity, and we have an awful lot of data on this reservoir and how it should behave. So we've modelled all of that. We've gone through a phase one, which was really the period sort of 2020, 2021 up to where we are now. And we got government approval to proceed to phase two, which is a consortium of 23 different companies, including Vince Shaw Dairy, who's one of our partners in this. And INEOS is leading on this particular project, along with academia, academies, drilling rig companies, other suppliers, ISO container suppliers, ship suppliers. There's a whole integrated chain around this. And all that will come to fruition where we will start to test the injectivity in December and then get to full injection probably towards the end of January. It's a fascinating project in that when I first arrived at INEOS, I was somewhat skeptical, having spent 20 years in the oil and gas industry, of talking about CCS, but never really seeing a project come to fruition, mostly because it generally needs incentives from government. And there have been a number of false starts here in the UK around incentives. It needs the right mix of know-how and technology. And it's a whole new frontier that we need to step into. But we are very optimistic about the probability of success for this, but we will know more, and so we'll need to test it and make sure this works. It's novel in that the CO2 is transported through ISO containers, so effectively there's no need for a pipeline. It's not some of these projects have pipelines that go out to inject the CO2. This will be off a rig, using ISO containers. It will be transported from INEOS Oxide, one of our businesses, where we'll source the CO2. And from the commercial phase, if we can test out the injectivity of the reservoir and be able to track where the CO2 goes and make sure that the integrity of the storage of the cap is sound, then we'll go to a full commercial FID to look at what the commercial options are. And that will require government incentives. What's really interesting is the current cost today is anywhere from 100 to 120 euros a tonne to inject the CO2. The cost of CO2 only less than a year ago was about 100 euros a tonne. Oh. So actually, even without incentives, there is the potential for it to be break even. Now, of course, if you assume a long run CO2 per tonne of around 55 euros a tonne, which is what it's typically been in Europe. It's been up around 80 more recently, but let's say 55 euros a tonne. Then you'd need an incentive of about 50 euros a tonne. Denmark, which is one of the most extraordinary countries in some respects, because they've been on this journey around the energy transition now for the best part of 30 years, have put incentives in place for wind, as you saw with the creation of Ørsted, incentives for hydrogen, incentives for integrated grids. I believe they will put incentives in place around CO2 carbon capture, and then we'll need to look at the commercial availability of that. What is clear is that there is an awful lot of green finance that would like to invest in these sort of projects. And I think if we can test out that the physics works, then we'll get into the commercial phase of this. And I think this could open up a huge opportunity, because this reservoir, the combined Siri-Nini reservoir, could store up to 8 million tonnes per annum of CO2, set against the Danish target of 20 million tonnes and a European target of 125 million tonnes. That would be a significant step forward around decarbonisation, carbon capture. No,
it's really interesting. And again, I'm sure we could talk about this for hours to come, but I think just to wrap it up, again, drawing on something that came up in the panel, I think the energy industry, the oil and gas industry specifically, is often vilified for being a fossil fuel industry and extracting resources out of the ground, whereas it perhaps doesn't receive enough recognition for the good work that it does do in decarbonising the energy mix and facilitating this transition pathway. I mean, from your perspective, I mean, what is appetite for sort of capital and investment into the sector, and what is capital availability looking like for oil and gas industry, sort of the oil and gas industry more broadly currently? Is there appetite and sort of a recognition, given the current environment, for the importance of the sector, or do these projects typically need to be sustainability linked as well to be able to access capital?
I mean, I think we've been through 4 energy transitions. The move from wood to coal, coal to oil, oil to gas. And actually in the middle of all that, in the 70s, you would have been celebrating what oil and gas had done in terms of, as Martin Lovegrove talked about, health, economic growth, all the things that have fueled in terms of energy, the things that we now take for granted today. 90% of this room, as I look around, maybe 80% of this particular room is made of petroleum products. Yeah. If I look at this table now in front of me, a lot of the things that we're looking at, these cameras, are all petroleum products. Yeah. They're all made up of some sort of petroleum product derivative. We have to recognise that we've tried, however, that energy mix is not sustainable going forward, and that's clear. And I don't think that's beyond any doubt. Nobody would dispute that. The question is, how do we push energy growth of low carbon alternatives or zero carbon alternatives, like nuclear, which I think is really important, like renewables, which we need to increase it's grown by 1,600% since 25 years ago, and it still only makes up 6.7% of the energy mix, and it's intermittent. So it can't give you that baseload supply of energy that you need and the affordability of energy that you need. And what we're seeing is now, I think there'll be a maturity in this next phase as people come back to recognising the importance of energy security and the cost on people's lives if you get that wrong. And therefore we have to continue to invest in oil and gas. Sadly, we'll continue to invest in coal. As I said, coal is a big part. It's what China is going to fuel economic growth in China. And when gas gets to a certain price, they flip to coal. That's what they do. And they export the gas here to Europe at much higher prices. Then we'll need to start to think about how do we invest in the decarbonisation part of this equation, and tapping into finance in that space, I think, will be really important. And I think that is the next big phase of growth, as people recognise that actually fossil fuels are part of this future going forward. But they can only be part of the future if we can decarbonise them. Yeah.
Well, Brian, that's a good note to end on. But thanks for your time. Appreciate your insight. Enjoyed your comments, and look forward to following your progress over the next 12, 24 months and beyond. So thank you.
Great. Thank you.